Okay, now I'm going to go over some of the more common growth forms in the alpine environment. Talk a little bit about this kind of, not really their adaptations, but the types of stress they can tolerate best so that we can start thinking about where they're going to be located within the alpine environment. So the growth forms I'm going to talk about are dwarf shrubs, forbs, and I put rosette here. We'll specifically talk about that rosette growth form, grasses, sedges, cushion plants, and then we'll talk briefly about the crumults vegetation growth form. I just have a few notes under the sedges here. You may not be familiar with sedges. They look a lot like grasses, but they're definitely different evolutionarily and phylogenetically. In some of the ways you can tell them apart, or kind of the easiest way, is that they have a solid and triangular culm. And so lots of people say the phrase sedges have edges, because if you see in this picture here, there's this real distinct triangular appearance to the kind of stems and the orientation of the leaves and how it grows. So very similar to grasses, but definitely different. And they can be found in really wet places. So a lot of times in wetland areas, you'll have sedges being one of the dominant growth forms. They're also really drought tolerant. And so like in the western Colorado and lots of dry places, there will be these big kind of circular areas that are dominated by sedges. And then they're also really cold tolerant, so you find them in cold places. And if you're not familiar with cushion plants and crumults, we'll talk about those as well. All right, so let's start off with dwarf shrubs. So these are going to be the tallest growth form that we have in the alpine environment. They're generally called dwarf shrubs because they tend to be less than a meter tall, and usually they're less than, a couple feet tall. So they're woody, they're definitely a shrub, but they're pretty short. Because they're the tallest growth form, they have the potential to experience the greatest temperature fluctuations. So those really cold nights, in cold times of the year, their leaves would be exposed to that because they're evergreen, but then also exposed to those warm temperatures as well. And the fact that they're tall and potentially exposed to these temperature swings has to do with where they're found in the alpine environment, and they tend to be found in places that are covered in snowpack during the winter to buffer them from those really cold temperatures. All right, forbs. And again, typically are most commonly found in this rosette growth form. So the rosette growth form is kind of this kind of circular orientation that the leaves grow in. So the leaves are growing all the way around the stem and fanning out. And what that does is it maximizes how many leaves it can have, but also minimizes the height it has to have. So it's kind of balancing number of leaves and height. The most common, well, maybe not the most common, but one of the plants we think about a lot that has the rosette growth form are dandelions. So if you think about how their leaves are growing in that circle real close to the ground, that's the rosette growth form. Because it allows them to be really short, then these plants get the benefit of those low wind speeds and the warmer temperatures near the surface. But they're not sorry, this is the first time I've talked today, so not typically tolerant really of any stresses. They're not great at tolerating drought or really cold temperatures, and they're okay at handling wet conditions. I'm putting grasses and sedges together because they look similar and they have similar tolerances, but remember they are indeed different phylogenetic groups. So just some pictures of the grasses and grasses and sedges that occur. This is kind of in an alpine meadow. You can see here this left picture, and all of these plants in here are sedges. They tend to be really drought tolerant. They can also be tolerant of saturated soils, so kind of flood tolerant. But also because they're investing really nothing in their stem, or very little in their stem. They're investing everything in their leaves. They're really good at growing quickly when the conditions are right. So in alpine systems where we have really short growing seasons, they can take advantage of those because they're not investing in anything but leaves, essentially. Okay, here's a picture of a cushion plant. So it kind of looks like the top of a pincushion. It's a really dense canopy and grows in this kind of like rounded mound kind of format, and they can be fairly small like this, and they can be a meter or so in diameter, so they can get quite large. These plants tend to be really drought tolerant, and then they can handle growing in these places of real high wind speeds just because of their low growth form in that compact canopy. And then lastly, here's that Crummelt's vegetation. So these are pictures of a couple trees that have grown in this form of what we refer to as Crummelt's. It's important to note, we'll go to the next slide, that Crummelt's isn't it's not genetically controlled. So that means it's not naturally how it grows. It's just a response to growing in high wind speeds. So if a tree does get established above tree line, some of them can survive. They just have this really weird growth form. And Crummelt's means like warped wood or twisted wood in German. These kind of, well, they're not super common. I mean, you see them when you go up there, but it's not like the whole area is dominated by Crummelt's vegetation, but they can play a really important role. You see in the figure here, this is mean wind velocity on the x-axis and distance from the surface of the mat or the top of that canopy. And then this is the winds, so these are the wind speeds. So essentially this is the wind speed profile if we were kind of draw a line. And you can see at the top of that surface or the mat and below, there's essentially no wind there. And so lots of plants can get started underneath the canopy of the Crummelt's vegetation. So it acts as like a nurse plant in these alpine areas. Okay, so those are the major growth forms that we're going to talk about. Now let's talk a little bit about where these occur in the alpine environment. So this picture here is from your reading, that Walker et al. Paper, which is kind of just a conceptual idea of the types of environments we find in the alpine. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through these and talk about the types of conditions they have for plants, or that they kind of exhibit, and then what the growth forms are that dominate those areas. So in the Walker paper, he talked a lot about the variability and kind of snowpack, which leads to when the snow melts and how much water is available for plants. And so this kind of temporal and spatial pattern of snowpack and snowmelt has a really big impact on kind of these different communities that we have within the alpine. And so in the US, in general, these are kind of the names we use for the different alpine environments. In Europe, they tend to use slightly different names, but of course they correlate to kind of the same types of conditions. But if we start on the right side here, so this prevailing wind direction is important because as wind is coming this way, it's going to carry the snow with it. But as it passes this ridge top, there's these eddies that form, and those eddies kind of pull some of the snow out and deposit it on this side of the slope. But as that wind continues to move across kind of this valley, it's going to clear and blow off a lot of the snow from this side of the slope and the ridge tops. So what we get is on the ridge tops, we have these areas referred to as fell field. And they really have no snow accumulation during the winter. And they're really rocky soils, very shallow soils. So there's not a lot of soil moisture there. Pretty harsh conditions here in the fell field. The dry meadow, on the other hand, also doesn't have a lot of snowpack, but there tends to be some snow. It's just really shallow, or maybe it's intermittent throughout the winter. Has a little bit deeper soils because it's a further down slope, so that some of the finer soil materials have moved down there. Down in the very valley bottom, we have the wet meadows. So you can kind of see there's potentially some snowpack down in the valley bottoms, but all of the moisture that's melting from the other snow drains down into valley bottoms, so they tend to be really wet, thus the name. Then the moist meadows are a little bit further up the slope. Fairly deep snowpack in places, but tends to be a little bit shallower than the snow bed. But again, because it's in the lower parts, it's getting a lot of the snow melt draining into the moist meadows, and so there tends to be a lot of moisture availability for plants during the growing season. And then on this slope here, we would have the snow bed, and that's kind of where we got this big, deep snowpack that occurs due to, again, that wind depositing the snow on this slope. So deep snowpack, yeah, so deep snowpack. We'll just leave it at that for now. So let's just talk through these different kind of vegetation classes or habitats in the Alpine, and I'll give you a rundown of what the characteristics are as far as the environmental conditions, and then what are the dominant 2 or 3 growth forms there. So in the fell field, again, those are the ones that are up on that ridge top. So no snowpack really, very coarse and rocky soils. What that means are kind of 2 things. There's very little soil moisture because there's no moisture to hold it, and there's no snow really melting, replenishing that soil moisture. But it does have a relatively long growing season because there's no snowpack. These plants don't have to wait for snow melt in the spring. As soon as the temperatures warm up, they can start growing. So the 2 most common growth forms are the cushion plants and sedges. And so remember, both of these growth forms can be pretty drought tolerant. And so they grow well in places, or they're successful in places that don't have a lot of soil moisture. These areas are also kind of unique in that they played a role in understanding the stress gradient hypothesis. So the stress gradient hypothesis suggests that as conditions get more and more harsh, the interactions between plants get more positive. Instead of negative competition, they actually can help facilitate each other. And so here in this graph, we have soil matrix potential. The more negative it is, the drier it is. All right. So the black bars are in general are higher values, so they're more moist. And the black bars represent the areas underneath the cushion plants. The open bars, or the white bars here, represent areas where there is no cushion plant. So they can help facilitate plant growth by increasing the soil moisture underneath the canopy of the cushion plants. And if you look at the survival of different species, you can see how much that soil moisture might play a role. And so we have 3 different species, and there are these are survival curves. So it's the percent. So if you look on the y-axis here, it's the percent of individuals surviving. So 0 means all the plants died of this particular species. And what you see is a big difference between the open symbols, which again represent areas outside of the cushion plants, versus the areas inside the cushion plants. So this first panel here is a really nice example where we have really high survival. So about 80% of the hordeum plants survived in the cushion plant area, and none survived outside the cushion plant by the end of the growing season. So just showing that big effect of the cushion plants on soil moisture and positive effects it can have on other species. All right, that's kind of a side note. Let's talk about dry meadows. So again, dry meadows are down the slope a little bit, but still mostly windswept. So there's not a lot of snowpack. There might be a thin layer of snow in the winter, but that would melt really quickly. So we have early snow melt and a relatively long growing season. Still not a lot of soil moisture, but the key is that there's more than in the fell field, because there is some snow there that melts and replenishes soil moisture, and any snow that might occur in the fell field a lot of that would drain down into the dry meadow. And so the dry meadows are typically dominated by sedges because of 2 reasons. They're drought tolerant, so they can handle that little soil moisture. But if you remember, I said the grasses and sedges are really good at capitalizing on the growing season. They're really fast growers, and so they're pretty competitive in this area as well. And so with those 2 factors, we see sedges dominating the dry meadow area. Okay, the moist meadows are in kind of the shallow end of the snowpack. So again, it's near that valley bottom, under the snowpack. Because it's in the shallow end, it has kind of a moderate growing season length. So it definitely has to wait for that snow to melt before the plants can start growing. But because it's shallower, it's longer than where that growing season is longer than where the snowpack is deeper. And there's a decent amount of soil moisture because of that snowpack that exists there. So the common growth forms we find in the moist meadow are forbs, grasses, and then some dwarf shrubs. The forbs and grasses don't invest a lot in woody tissue, so they can grow fairly quickly, get lots of photosynthate accumulated in those growing seasons. But in places where that snowpack is fairly deep, you might get some dwarf shrubs showing up because they can survive in those areas where their leaves are covered by the snow all year long. And then snow bed. The snow bed is going to be where the snowpack is the deepest. It's going to have the shortest growing season then because it takes a long time to melt all of that snow off, but there's going to be plenty of moisture there. The dwarf shrubs are this is kind of the only place where dwarf shrubs are dominant and really abundant. And that's again because of that deep snowpack. These are evergreen species, and where there's that snowpack that's deep enough, they can survive, their leaves can survive the winter, and that's where they're most common. But we also see forbs, sedges, and grasses, and then some of the bryophytes occurring more commonly in this area. Then we have the wet meadow, so that's going to be at the very bottom of the valley where all that snow melt is draining down to. It has fairly a short growing season because of late snow melt, but also it tends to be saturated or kind of flooded most of the growing season because all of that snow melt just keeps draining down to the valley bottom. And so that can limit the plant growth in that area for most of the growing season. We have sedges and forbs dominating this area. Where it's the most saturated, it's going to be dominated by sedges. And then in some of the areas where maybe it's not saturated all the time, you definitely can have forb species growing in those areas. Okay, then I'm also just going to mention the shrub tundra. We didn't talk about this as one of the kind of habitats or vegetation classes in the alpine environment, but it is important to talk about. Kind of anywhere that is the most mild conditions in the alpine, that's where you're going to find the shrub tundra. So generally it's kind of like the lower end of the alpine environment, and by low I mean lower elevation, or just any pockets where it might have a fairly long growing season but still a lot of moisture, because these plants that dominate the shrub tundra need lots of water. And so generally we think about this as being those riparian systems and those willow dominated riparian systems. And so this kind of like vegetation starting at this rock that's in the left foreground here and going down, this is a lot of salix species growing along this drainage here. And then there would be willows down here along that river as well.